It usually happens when you least expect it. You're just sitting on your couch on a Tuesday evening, maybe watching TV, and your phone buzzes.
Yeah, that dreaded evening buzz.
Right, and you glance down, and it's a two-line email from your manager. It's vague, maybe slightly curt, and suddenly your stomach drops, your heart rate spikes, and your mind just starts racing.
Oh, absolutely. The physical reaction is immediate.
It really is. It's literally just text on a screen, but your body is reacting as if someone just, kicked in your front door.
We see this profound, almost violent physical reaction to what is, objectively, a totally mundane digital event. It happens all the time. People experience it constantly, yet they rarely understand the actual biological machinery driving it.
And that is exactly the mission of our deep dive today. We are exploring a really comprehensive psychological playbook for surviving and, well, outsmarting a toxic boss.
Because you really need a playbook for this. It's not something you can just wing.
Exactly. Our source material breaks down the exact mechanisms of workplace toxicity. It identifies 4 distinct types of toxic managers and the targeted strategies you need to handle them. But before we get to the actual strategies, we really have to establish the baseline of why a bad manager affects you on such a deep, visceral level.
Right. The biological baseline is crucial here.
Yeah, and the most striking element in the sources is that the human brain processes a threatening boss using the exact same neural pathways it uses to process a physical predator in the wild.
We operate under this illusion that our modern corporate environments have somehow decoupled us from our hunter-gatherer hardware. But they haven't. The brain's threat detection systems are ancient, and they are highly conserved.
Okay, let's unpack this mechanism. Why does a slightly passive-aggressive message from a middle manager trigger an actual survival response? Why does it feel like literal danger?
Well, it comes down to how your nervous system calculates a concept called power asymmetry. Your nervous system is constantly scanning your environment, right? And it correctly identifies that this specific individual, your boss, holds the keys to your baseline survival resources.
Which, in the modern world, aren't things like food and water.
Exactly. In a modern context, survival resources aren't access to a watering hole. They are your paycheck, your healthcare, your professional reputation, and your schedule.
Because they ultimately control the distribution of all those things.
Yeah, exactly. The power asymmetry is heavily skewed. So when someone holds that degree of control over your basic security, your brain's threat detection center, which is the amygdala, becomes hypersensitized to them.
Oh, wow. So it's literally rewiring how much attention you pay to them.
It really is. It allocates this disproportionate amount of cognitive bandwidth to monitoring their moods, their microexpressions, even their tone in a random Slack message. So when you get that cold email, your biology is quite literally signaling that the person who controls whether or not you eat is acting unpredictably.
And therefore, you must prepare for a threat.
Precisely. Your body is prepping for danger.
I want to speak directly to you listening right now. If you ever found yourself rehearsing a massive defensive argument with your boss while just standing in the shower, an argument you'll never actually have out loud, or if you've ever felt that creeping physical dread on a Sunday night, you are not crazy.
No, not at all.
It is not a character flaw. It's not a sign of weakness. It is pure, unadulterated biology at work.
Your nervous system is actually functioning exactly as designed. It is keeping you alert to an active threat. The critical failure point here, though, is that this system evolved to manage acute short-term threats.
Like running from a bear.
Right, exactly. You spot a predator, you run, you survive, and your nervous system resets to baseline. But with a toxic manager, the threat is sitting in the cubicle next to you or inhabiting your inbox Monday through Friday, week after week. The alarm never shuts off.
And the chronic nature of it is what breaks the body down. The lion never actually leaves the watering hole.
Exactly. That chronic activation prevents your HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, from downregulating. This means your cortisol baseline shifts permanently upward. And we see very specific cascading physical effects from this.
Like sleep issues, right. The sources mention sleep gets completely wrecked.
Oh, severe sleep disruption is incredibly common because that elevated cortisol actively interferes with your brain's ability to enter and maintain deep REM sleep long after you've logged off for the day.
It also alters behavioral patterns outside the office. The data shows a sharp decline in physical exercise during these toxic stretches. And, people often blame themselves for being lazy. But the reality is that the emotional labor of constantly maintaining a state of high alert leaves the central nervous system with absolutely no reserves.
That's spot on. Emotional exhaustion directly depletes your physical energy reserves. We also observe a huge shift in dietary habits, specifically an increased drive towards sugar and refined carbohydrates.
Because your brain is just desperate for a win.
Yes, your brain, completely depleted of normal reward signals in this hostile environment, desperately searches for a rapid, easily accessible hit of dopamine.
Hmm.
It's trying to artificially offset the lack of psychological safety.
The data mapping this physical toll is striking, honestly. There was a Swedish study that tracked over 3,000 employees for more than a decade, and the researchers found a direct, measurable correlation between working under a destructive manager and an increased risk of cardiovascular disease.
It is quite literally a biological stress test on the heart.
Yeah, and beyond that, Harvard Business School quantified what they call the negativity bias multiplier.
Oh, that study is fascinating. They tracked the emotional weight of workplace interactions and found that it takes roughly 5 positive interactions to neurologically neutralize the impact of a single toxic interaction with a manager.
5 to 1.
Yeah, because the brain weights the negative interaction 5 times heavier. Negative information is just more vital for your raw survival.
Then we have the University of Manchester study on toxic leadership contagion. They demonstrated that employees unconsciously mirror a toxic manager's harshness. They start directing it toward their coworkers, their direct reports, and even internalizing it against themselves.
It's a brilliant, if terrifying, illustration of normalization.
Right, it's like moving into a house built next to a heavy freight train track. Initially, the noise and the shaking are just unbearable, but over time, your brain filters out the noise. The problem is the physical vibration continues to steadily crack the foundation of the house anyway.
What's fascinating here is that the brain is highly adaptive, which actually works against you in a toxic dynamic. It attempts to conserve energy by normalizing whatever environment it is repeatedly exposed to.
So you just get used to the poison.
Basically, yeah. If you sit in a state of high alert for 6 months, your nervous system begins to treat that chronic tension as the new baseline. You stop recognizing the cognitive friction. You just assume work is inherently stressful, blinding yourself to how aberrant and damaging the situation actually is until severe burnout sets in.
Which means understanding that biological baseline forces a major pivot in how we approach the solution. A key takeaway from our source material is that generic one-size-fits-all advice like just communicate better fundamentally fails.
It absolutely feels.
Treating all toxic managers as if they operate on the same psychological hardware is a massive strategic error.
Because the strategy that successfully neutralizes one type of toxicity will actively exacerbate another. Psychological profiling in the workplace has actually identified 4 distinct patterns of destructive management driven by very different internal deficits.
Right, so we can categorize them by looking first at managers who destabilize your emotional baseline.
Let's do that.
Let's look at the highly reactive end of the spectrum first. Type 1, the volcano. This is the manager whose behavior is just wildly unpredictable. They might be perfectly calm and supportive in a morning meeting, and then absolutely erupt over a minor formatting error in the afternoon.
The psychological mechanism driving the volcano is a severe deficit in emotional regulation. And this is frequently compounded by immense unmanaged pressure they're absorbing from higher up in the organization.
So it rolls downhill.
Exactly. They lack the tools to process their own stress, so they aggressively vent it downward onto their direct reports.
And the default mistake people make here is attempting to manage the volcano's board, right? You start walking on eggshells, heavily editing your own behavior, or preemptively absorbing the blame just to de-escalate the situation and make the screaming stop.
Which just reinforces the dynamic. The effective strategy is something clinical psychologists refer to as strategic detachment. You have to consciously label their behavior in real time. You deliberately think to yourself, this is a manifestation of his unmanaged stress, not a reflection of my performance.
And then you document it.
Right. You follow this up by maintaining a private, factual, written log of these incidents as a reality anchor.
Let's look at Sarah, a marketing coordinator from our sources in Chicago. Her managing was a textbook volcano. For a year, she internalized the outbursts, assuming she was just constantly failing. But once she applied strategic detachment, silently repeating the phrase, his pressure, not my failure, during the eruptions, and kept a simple, date-stamped log of what actually occurred, her Sunday night dread disappeared.
We should really clarify the specific mechanism of why this works, though.
Actually, I do want to push back on this strategy for a moment, because by silently repeating a mantra and logging the facts, aren't we just quietly enduring verbal abuse? I mean, why is the burden on the employee to do the mental gymnastics to tolerate a grown adult throwing a tantrum?
That is a completely fair question,
Mhm.
and it is a vital distinction to make. Strategic detachment is not about endurance or excusing the behavior. Think of emotional contagion like a virus.
Okay, a vibe.
Yeah. For a virus to infect you, it requires a specific host receptor to latch onto. When you over-apologize, internalize the blame, or try to actively soothe the volcano, you are providing that emotional receptor.
Oh, I see.
Strategic detachment removes the receptor entirely. You are building a cognitive firewall so that their erratic behavior cannot rewrite your professional self-image. Volcanoes frequently employ gaslighting, minimizing their outbursts later to make you question your own memory. The factual log serves as an objective anchor, keeping your reality intact when they attempt to warp it.
Right, so you are neutralizing the emotional payload before it detonates in your own nervous system.
Precisely.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, on the complete opposite end of the emotional spectrum is type 2, the ghost.
Yes, the ghost. The ghost presents no aggressive behavior at all. They are entirely absent, they provide vague directives, they are perpetually unavailable for feedback, and they actively flee from any form of necessary conflict or decision-making.
It's like working for a hologram.
Exactly. And the psychological driver here is profound conflict avoidance and severe cognitive overwhelm.
So the trap employees fall into with a ghost is waiting patiently for clarity. You assume they are just busy, so you wait for direction that is never going to arrive. And then inevitably you blame yourself when a project goes off the rails because you were forced to guess what the priorities were.
Which is incredibly unfair to you. With a ghost, the required strategy is proactive structure. You must completely eliminate open-ended questions from your communication.
Because open-ended questions are too much work for them.
Yes. Asking a ghost, "How do you think we should handle this?" places a massive burden of cognitive friction and emotional labor on someone who's already avoiding decisions. You have to switch entirely to closed yes or no boundaries.
The example in the material was Jennifer, a nurse manager. She reported to an administrator who was a total ghost. She would ask for operational guidance and just receive absolute silence. So she shifted her strategy to proactive structure.
And what happened?
Instead of asking for input, she sent emails stating, "I will proceed with staffing plan A by Friday at noon unless I hear otherwise. Please reply yes or no." And suddenly, the ghost started responding immediately.
Because she engineered the friction out of the interaction, she took on the heavy lifting of formulating the decision herself, reducing the ghost's required input to a simple binary choice.
The ghost no longer had to process a complex problem, they merely had to agree.
Right. She stabilized her working environment by forcefully structuring the boundaries of the communication.
Okay, so those first two types, the volcano and the ghost, fundamentally destabilize your emotional baseline. But the source material highlights another category of managers entirely. These are the ones who might maintain a perfectly pleasant emotional demeanor, but they actively interfere with your structural career progression. This brings us to type 3, the credit thief.
Oh, the credit thief. They are often highly charismatic and very pleasant in daily interactions. Yet somehow, the strategic initiatives you developed consistently get presented to the executive suite as their original concepts.
It's mad.
It is. The psychological driver here is deep-seated insecurity. They are acutely aware of their own lack of competence, and they mask it by aggressively harvesting yours.
And the dangerous assumption employees make here is relying on this meritocratic ideal. You assume that if you just keep your head down and produce excellent quiet work, the organization will eventually recognize your value. But working for a credit thief means your quiet competence simply fuels their loud promotion.
Which is why the countermeasure is establishing a highly visible, undeniable paper trail. And importantly, this does not require aggressive confrontation.
It doesn't.
No, it just requires making visibility a standard operational habit. You send concise recap emails immediately following meetings, summarizing the ideas you proposed, and you routinely cease relevant external stakeholders.
Like Michael, a financial analyst in Dallas who dealt with this exact scenario. He watched his manager routinely present his complex financial models as her own work, and rather than sparking an interpersonal conflict, he implemented the visible paper trail. After every strategy session, he sent a brief summary of his proposed models, deliberately copying 2 senior directors on the thread. And within a single quarter, those senior directors were bypassing his manager and citing Michael's data directly. He reclaimed his intellectual property without a single heated conversation.
He essentially made the origin of the competence so structurally visible that it could no longer be quietly absorbed in the shadows.
Which brings us to the final and frequently the most exhausting archetype, type 4, the micromanager.
Ah, yes.
This manager demands total visibility into every single keystroke. They question minor, inconsequential decisions and supervise you as if you lack basic industry knowledge, regardless of your tenure or your past success.
It's exhausting. And the primary driver for the micromanager is acute anxiety. They're operating under an intense fear of negative evaluation from their own superiors.
So they're terrified of messing up.
Yes. They are terrified of being blamed for team failure, so they attempt to eliminate risk by gripping the operational steering wheel as tightly as humanly possible.
The two common mistakes people make are total submission or open rebellion. Submission proves to the manager that you require constant supervision, which just validates their behavior. But open rebellion, like pushing back against their check-ins, that spikes their anxiety, causing them to clamp down even harder.
Right, so the recommended approach is proactive transparency. You voluntarily push brief, unsolicited updates to them before they have the opportunity to ask.
Okay, I look at that strategy, and my immediate thought is that sending unsolicited updates is just rewarding bad behavior. Aren't you basically validating their invasive need to hover over your work?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it seems counterintuitive until you look at the mechanism of their anxiety. Their anxiety thrives on the unknown, the blind spot.
Okay, I follow you.
If you withhold information to protect your autonomy, you expand that blind spot, which sends their threat detection into overdrive. By pushing the information proactively, you eliminate the blind spot. You are starving their anxiety of the unknown variables it requires to survive.
Oh, wow. So you demonstrate that you are managing this risk on their behalf.
Exactly. The data clearly shows that this proactive feeding of information earns you structural autonomy far faster than fighting them for it.
Okay, so we have a really targeted playbook. Strategic detachment for the volcano, proactive structure for the ghost, a visible paper trail for the credit thief, and proactive transparency for the micromanager.
But the sources make a crucial point here. Knowing the behavioral strategy is only half the battle. We have to dismantle the internal psychological traps that keep us anchored to a toxic dynamic, even when we are executing the right playbook.
Because the behavioral strategies protect your daily workflow, but we have to address the internal cognitive distortions. Toxic environments implant deeply ingrained myths about workplace dynamics that employees internalize as absolute truth.
Yes.
Let's tear down the most pervasive myth first. The belief that if you were simply better at your job or just work harder, your toxic boss would eventually treat you with respect.
It is a complete fallacy. The toxicity is rooted entirely in the manager's internal psychological deficits, not in your performance metrics. High performers are actually targeted more frequently and more aggressively.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The irony is profound. You increase your output to appease them, and it actively paints a larger target on your back.
Right, because a high performer represents a structural threat to an insecure manager. Your competence highlights their incompetence.
That makes so much sense.
Another dangerous myth is the assumption that a strong, overarching company culture will insulate you from a bad direct manager.
Oh, the statistical variance there is incredible. A major workplace analytics study found that a person's direct manager accounts for 70% of the variance in their team engagement and overall job satisfaction. 70%.
It's huge.
A company can offer, unlimited paid time off, comprehensive wellness programs, and a pristine mission statement. None of it matters. If your direct manager is toxic, your lived experience of the company is toxic.
This is exactly why it is critical to actively manage the internal psychological traps. The most common is the rumination loop.
Oh, I know this one.
Right. It's the experience of staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m., endlessly replaying a perceived slight or planning a hypothetical defense. This is driven by the Zeigarnik effect, where the brain fixates on unresolved social conflicts. It attempts to solve an unsolvable puzzle while just flooding your system with stress hormones.
There's also the habit of over-apologizing for circumstances outside your control, which systematically rewires your neural pathways to accept a subordinate defensive posture. And the performance spiral, where you continually extend your working hours, chasing a moving goalpost, just trying to beat criticism that was never actually tied to the quality of your work.
Yeah. The most destructive trap, however, is identity fusion.
What's that?
This occurs when you allow one highly flawed, psychologically compromised manager's assessment of your work to become the singular defining metric of your objective professional worth. You conflate their power asymmetry with universal truth.
That is so dangerous. So to break these cognitive traps, the research points to executing specific environment shifts. The first is implementing a transition ritual. This is a deliberate 2 to 3 minute pause between the cessation of work and the beginning of your personal evening.
It functions as a neurological circuit breaker.
Yeah.
By engaging in a consistent grounding action like changing your clothes, taking a short walk, or even just doing a structured breathing exercise, you send a definitive signal to your vagus nerve that the period of threat monitoring has ended.
It forces that HPA axis we discussed earlier to finally begin downregulating.
Exactly.
It's also vital to physically quarantine your workspace from your rest space, especially in remote setups. Never bring the laptop into the bedroom. But the most powerful tool detailed in the source material is the necessity of maintaining an outside witness. How does that function in practice?
An outside witness is a specific individual, a mentor, a former colleague, or a peer in a completely different division who exists entirely outside your immediate reporting structure. You maintain regular, candid communication with them about your workplace dynamics
Why is that distance so important?
because prolonged exposure to a toxic manager warps your perception of reality. They systematically gaslight you into believing your standards are wrong or your competence is failing. The outside witness acts as an objective reality anchor.
So they can tell you you're not crazy.
Right. They possess the distance required to look at the situation and confirm, no, that request is entirely unreasonable, or your work on that project was excellent. They interrupt the identity fusion before it can fully erode your self-worth.
Let's project this forward into the long game. Say you execute perfectly. You identify that you are working for a Volcano. You deploy strategic detachment. You initiate your neurological transition rituals. You regularly consult your outside witness to maintain your grip on reality. You do everything right, and the environment remains fundamentally toxic. How do you objectively know when it is finally time to formulate an exit plan?
Well, the decision to leave should never be a reactive snap judgment, driven by a particularly grueling Tuesday afternoon. However, the psychological research provides a highly objective framework for this decision. You run it as a clinical experiment.
An experiment?
Yeah, you identify the manager archetype. You deploy the targeted strategy, whether that's proactive structure or a visible paper trail. And you maintain that strategy with absolute consistency for a period of 2 to 3 months.
You run the protocol and you observe the variables.
Correct. If you run the specific protocol for a quarter and the dynamic remains entirely unchanged or worsens, you have generated irrefutable data.
The data proves that the friction is caused by an unresolvable lack of systemic fit, rather than a lack of capability or effort on your part. At that juncture, you have to trust the objective evidence you've gathered over the lingering emotional impulse to just, endure the situation indefinitely.
It is a profound shift in perspective. Leaving a toxic role isn't an admission of defeat. It is an evidence-based strategic decision. And the documentation you've gathered, the visible paper trails, the project recaps, the objective logs of your structural contributions that can all be repurposed.
Well, that's smart.
You utilize that exact documentation to clearly articulate your value in your interviews for your next role. We saw the listener in the source material do exactly this. They used their paper trail to prove their high-level impact to a new organization.
They successfully reclaimed their professional autonomy before they even handed in their resignation.
They neutralized the power asymmetry on their own terms.
We've mapped the biological machinery, broken down the 4 archetypes, detailed the strategic countermeasures, and defined the parameters for an evidence-based exit plan. That is a lot of ground covered.
This raises an important question, however, about the broader implications of the environments we build and sustain.
It absolutely does. I will leave you with this final thought to examine as you process all of this. If our ancient nervous system is so heavily hardwired to interpret a toxic manager as a physical predator, what specific dynamics does it interpret as a sanctuary? What does a neurologically safe environment actually look like when we build one? And perhaps most importantly, as you navigate your own professional landscape tomorrow, how can you actively ensure that you are serving as an outside witness for a colleague who might currently be isolated and caught in the predator's gaze?
A vital question for anyone in the workplace.
Until next time.